Remember, you used your position within the federal government to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air in a clear attempt to chill free speech. You told ABC we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The FCC is not a political weapon to be used against the president's critics. And yet, you've also used it to go after 60 Minutes, Saturday Night Live, and Seth Meyers, all because the president did not like their criticism or because they gave airtime to his opponents. Your Twitter account before 2025 would seem to align with what I'm saying. It is filled to the brim with statements defending freedom of speech, as well as stating that the FCC does not have a roving mandate to police speech in the name of...
You just witnessed the spectacle of American democracy teetering on the precipice of collapse, because what Senator Tammy Baldwin laid out in that hearing room yesterday wasn't just political theater or partisan hyperbole. This was the desperate alarm bell ringing in the halls of the Senate Commerce Committee, as the FCC is not formally independent, according to Brendan Carr himself. And I need you to understand the seismic implications of what we're watching unfold, because when Federal Communications Commission Chair Brendan Carr suggested Jimmy Kimmel should be suspended and said we can do this the easy way or the hard way, ABC and its local affiliates were listening, and within a matter of hours ABC suspended Kimmel's show indefinitely, a stunning move that has raised serious First Amendment concerns, and this is precisely the kind of soft authoritarianism that political scientists who study democratic backsliding have been screaming about for years, because the mechanism isn't always jackboots and tanks. It's regulatory capture weaponized against dissent. It's the sinister choreography of governmental pressure meeting corporate cowardice in a dance that strangles freedom without ever pulling a trigger. What we're witnessing is jawboning in its most pernicious form, and here's why this should terrify every single person who claims to value the constitutional architecture that separates liberal democracy from autocracy, because this is what's known as jawboning, when state actors use threats to inappropriately compel private action, and when a network drops high-profile talent hours after the FCC chairman makes a barely veiled threat, then it's no longer just a business decision, it's government coercion. And the chilling precision with which this unfolded tells you everything you need to know about the coordinated assault on independent media that's accelerating under this administration. Now let's talk about who Brendan Carr actually is, and why this man represents the most dangerous kind of bureaucratic enforcer in the Trump authoritarian playbook, because Carr is known for wearing a gold-colored pin modeled on Trump's profile, and Trump appointed Carr to a Republican seat on the commission in 2017 during his first term, before he elevated him to the top job, which is the kind of performative loyalty signaling that would make Viktor Orban's apparatchiks blush, and the intellectual architecture undergirding Carr's transformation from ostensibly principled regulator into Trump's attack dog is documented in his own words, because he wrote a chapter about the FCC for the Heritage Foundation's Mandate for Leadership policy document, better known as Project 2025, and in the opening to his chapter, Carr wrote the FCC should promote freedom of speech, and the Orwellian doublespeak embedded in that statement is breathtaking, because what he actually means is the FCC should promote speech that flatters Trump and crush speech that criticizes him, which is the exact inverse of what the First Amendment was designed to protect. And here's the bombshell that should be dominating every news cycle, because in the 8 months since becoming chair of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr has waged war against the free speech of those who have reported on, criticized, or satirized the president, which is a deliberate, systematic campaign of intimidation that recalls the authoritarian playbooks deployed in Hungary, Poland, and Russia, where media capture becomes the precondition for democratic collapse, and we have the receipts because the First Amendment operates as a restraint on the government, Carr told Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire at an oversight hearing in 2018, saying the whole purpose of the First Amendment is to encourage strong, robust, perhaps rough in some situations, discourse, and at the FCC my job is to act consistent with the First Amendment in every single thing, and act consistent with the First Amendment rights of the media and the journalists, and I can commit to you that I'll continue to do that. Except that was then, and this is now, and Carr has abandoned every principle he ever articulated about free speech the moment Trump dangled the chairman position in front of him. Let's pause on that hearing room moment, where Senator Baldwin eviscerated this man, because the clip you just watched captures the essence of what's at stake here. During a Senate Commerce Committee hearing, Democrat Sen. Tammy Baldwin told Carr, You used your position within the federal government to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air in a clear attempt to chill free speech. And that phrase, chill free speech, is the operative constitutional violation, because you don't need to formally censor someone to violate the First Amendment. You just need to create an environment where networks and affiliates preemptively capitulate out of fear of regulatory retaliation. And that's exactly what happened, because Nexstar, an owner of ABC affiliate stations across the United States, announced after Carr's podcast appearance that it would preempt Kimmel's show for the foreseeable future because of his comments. Nexstar recently said it hopes to take over a rival firm, Tegna, in a blockbuster $6.2 billion deal, one that would require FCC approval. Then the bigger shoe dropped, as ABC announced it was indefinitely suspending Jimmy Kimmel Live, the network's late-night franchise. And the quid pro quo couldn't be more transparent if Carr had written it in skywriting over Disney headquarters, because Nexstar needs FCC approval for its merger, and Carr just demonstrated he's willing to hold that approval hostage to corporate compliance with Trump's enemies list. And this is exactly how authoritarians consolidate power without ever formally outlawing opposition speech. They just make the cost of dissent economically untenable for the corporations that control distribution. And Senator Baldwin nailed the other dimension of this corruption when she pointed out that Carr used his position within the federal government to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air in a clear attempt to chill free speech, and the FCC is not a political weapon to be used against the president's critics, and yet you've also used it to go after 60 Minutes Saturday Night Live and Seth Meyers, because this isn't about one comedian making one joke. This is a systematic targeting of every satirical voice, every investigative journalism outlet, every platform that dares to hold Trump accountable. And the pattern is undeniable because Carr has launched formal investigations of all of the nation's major broadcast networks, including NPR, and the one exception is Fox, owned by Trump's political ally Rupert Murdoch, which tells you everything you need to know about the selective enforcement regime that Carr is constructing, where loyalty to Trump determines whether you get investigated or protected. The fact that Fox News is the only major network exempt from Carr's inquisition is such a perfect encapsulation of authoritarian media strategy that it could be a case study in Ruth Ben-Ghiat's course on fascism, because authoritarian leaders don't destroy all media. They bifurcate it into regime loyalists who get rewarded and independent outlets who get crushed, and we're watching that bifurcation happen in real time on American soil. Now here's where the constitutional crisis deepens into something truly alarming, because when Democratic senators pressed Carr on the fundamental question of FCC independence, Sen. Ben Ray Lujan asked Carr, yes or no, is the FCC an independent agency? And the FCC is not formally an independent agency. Carr responded, and then in an act of Kafkaesque institutional erasure, shortly after Carr made that statement, the FCC apparently removed the word independent in a description of the agency's work on its websites, which is the kind of reality-bending Orwell would be proud authoritarian information control that signals we're not debating policy differences anymore, we're watching the deliberate dismantling of institutional safeguards in real time. The FCC was designed as an independent regulatory agency precisely to prevent it from becoming a political weapon wielded by whoever occupies the White House. But Carr just announced to the world that independence is a fiction, and he reports directly to Trump. And when Senator Kim pressed him on whether Trump is his boss, Carr refused to disown his comments about Kimmel, and when questioned by Democrats about an agency long considered autonomous, suggested it was not insulated from Trump's pressure, and Carr later sidestepped questions about whether he considered the Republican president to be his boss, and whether he had taken orders from Trump or his inner circle, which is the silence that speaks volumes, because if the answer was no, he would have said no, but instead we got evasion and deflection, because the truth is Carr knows exactly who he works for, and it's not the American people or the Constitution, it's Donald Trump. Let me hammer home why this matters beyond the specific case of Jimmy Kimmel, because FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez issued a statement hitting the Trump administration for seizing on a late-night comedian's inopportune joke as a pretext to punish speech it disliked. But Gomez had even harsher words for ABC and Disney, calling the decision to pull Kimmel's show a shameful show of cowardly capitulation that has put the foundation of the First Amendment in danger. And as a legal matter, Gomez clarified that Carr's extreme threats are toothless, because this FCC does not have the authority, the ability, or the constitutional right to police content or punish broadcasters for speech the government dislikes. Then that's the crucial point that gets obscured in all the procedural debates, because Carr is operating in what former Obama-era FCC chair Tom Wheeler describes as a legal gray area, and Tom Wheeler, the chair of the FCC during President Barack Obama's second term, said Carr was wielding incredible coercive power by launching investigations and threatening to hold up mergers while stopping short of taking formal FCC votes against Trump administration opponents, and Carr is working in a legal gray area. Wheeler said by publicly stating how he wants media companies to act without forcing a formal FCC vote because this has been the artful way that the Trump administration has been able to exercise this kind of coercive influence without triggering court review, which is the sophisticated authoritarian technique of never quite crossing the bright line into formal censorship but creating such intense informal pressure that the outcome is identical. And that's why this is more dangerous than if they just tried to ban Kimmel outright, because at least then we'd have a clear First Amendment case to litigate. But instead we have this sinister shadow system of regulatory intimidation that achieves censorship through coercion. And we need to talk about the corporate capitulation dimension of this crisis, because while Carr and Trump are the villains wielding governmental power, Disney and ABC and Nexstar and Sinclair are the craven collaborators who chose profit over principle. Ana Gomez said what we are seeing is this administration intimidate broadcasters to get them to change what it is that they broadcast, whether it's airing of comedians or by telling news organizations that they have to alter their editorial practices. And this is the cowardly corporate capitulation that is fraying our constitutional values, and it's very dangerous and it is improper. Because these media conglomerates had the resources and the legal standing to fight back, they could have stood firm and forced Trump and Carr to either back down or take formal action that could be challenged in court. But instead they folded instantly because the consolidation of media ownership has meant Trump and Carr have fewer corporate players to target, and each of those players have multiple vulnerabilities, which means the decades of deregulation and media consolidation that concentrated ownership in the hands of a few massive corporations has created the perfect conditions for authoritarian capture, because these corporations have so many business dealings requiring government approval that they can't afford to antagonize the president. This is why media ownership concentration isn't just an economic issue, it's a democracy issue. Because when you have 3 or 4 companies controlling most of American media, and each of those companies has pending mergers or regulatory matters before federal agencies, you've created a system where one authoritarian-minded president can bring the entire apparatus to heel without firing a shot. Let's zoom out to the broader pattern of Trump administration assaults on press freedom, because the Kimmel case is just the most visible manifestation of a systematic campaign. President Trump celebrated the suspension of comedian Jimmy Kimmel and suggested the government could go after the licenses of broadcast networks that are critical of him, and President Trump says that broadcasters allowing criticism of him should, quote, maybe lose their license, which is Trump saying the quiet part loud. He's not even pretending anymore that this is about content standards or public interest obligations. He's openly declaring that criticism of him should be grounds for stripping broadcast licenses, which is textbook authoritarianism. And there are many examples of Trump and his administration using the power they have to go after the media. And in the first term he complained about his coverage, but this time he is actively working to change it, which captures the escalation that should alarm anyone who understands how authoritarian consolidation works, because Trump 1.0 was testing the boundaries, seeing what he could get away with. But Trump 2.0 is implementing the authoritarian playbook with the confidence of someone who knows the institutional guardrails have been weakened and the opposition has been demoralized. And here's where it gets even more sinister, because there's this extraordinary degree to which there's a consolidation of media companies that often requires government approval, and the willingness of this administration to use that as a leverage to influence what comes out of those media companies as a result. And Democrats are making a case that that's resulting in the intimidation and chilling of free speech by journalists, by satirists, and by others, which means every merger, every acquisition, every license renewal becomes a potential leverage point for political control. And we've already seen evidence of this working, because in July, the FCC approved the $8.4 billion merger between CBS parent Paramount Global and Skydance Media, after Skydance agreed to ensure CBS's news and entertainment programs were free of bias and hire an ombudsman to review complaints and end diversity programs, which is an absolutely extraordinary concession that means the FCC under Carr is now extracting ideological commitments from media companies as a condition of merger approval, and you should be asking yourself what free of bias means when it's being defined by an FCC chairman who wears a Trump loyalty pin on his lapel. Because I guarantee you, it doesn't mean balanced coverage, it means coverage that doesn't anger Trump. Now I want you to sit with the historical parallel for a moment, because what we're watching is the American version of a playbook that's been deployed in Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and Russia. The US is showing signs of undergoing a rapid authoritarian shift, as civic freedoms in the country decline following President Donald Trump's return to the White House, according to Civicus, an international network of civil society groups that advocates for stronger civil liberties, which downgraded its assessment of U.S. civic freedoms from narrowed to obstructed in a new report, and they warn that long-established democracies are showing signs of rapid authoritarian shift marked by weakened rule of law and growing constraints on independent civil society, because international human rights monitors who track democratic backsliding globally are now sounding the alarm about the United States using the same language they use to describe authoritarian deterioration in places like Hungary, and press freedom is under pressure with censorship, judicial harassment, and political interference manifesting in the cancellation or suspension of major talk shows, funding cuts affecting independent media, and tighter restrictions on White House press access, which means the world is watching America slide toward authoritarianism in real time, and organizations that monitor global freedom are documenting the decline. And let's be crystal clear about the role of Republican enablers in this nightmare, because while Carr is the instrument of oppression, there's a broader GOP infrastructure that's either actively supporting or passively tolerating this assault on constitutional freedoms, and the exception that proves the rule is fascinating because Ted Cruz said about Carr's comments, "I like Brendan Carr, he's a good guy, he's the chairman of the FCC, I work closely with him, but what he said there is dangerous as hell," and Ted Cruz called Carr's comments dangerous as hell, saying, "I think it is unbelievably dangerous for government to put itself in the position of saying, we're going to decide what speech we like and what we don't, and we're going to threaten to take you off air if we don't like what you're saying," which means even Ted Cruz, who is hardly a civil libertarian icon, recognized that Carr crossed a constitutional red line. But then in the actual hearing, on Wednesday, Cruz called Kimmel angry, overtly partisan, and profoundly unfunny. And another area of agreement between you and I is that Jimmy Kimmel is angry, overtly partisan, and profoundly unfunny. That sadly is true for most late-night comedians today, who seem to have been collectively broken by President Trump's election, Cruz said to Carr on the matter, which shows you the moral cowardice at the heart of Republican opposition to Trump, because Cruz will acknowledge in private or on his podcast that Carr's tactics are dangerous as hell, but when it comes time to hold Carr accountable in a public hearing, Cruz pivots to attacking Kimmel and offering Carr political cover. Here's what should make every progressive activist, every civil libertarian, every person who claims to care about constitutional democracy, absolutely livid, because Democrats painted Carr, who was appointed by President Donald Trump, as a threat to free speech, and questioned whether the FCC was an independent arbiter, not beholden to the politics of a given presidential administration, and FCC Commissioner Ana Gomez, who was appointed by former President Joe Biden, told the panel that under Carr, the agency is working to intimidate government critics, pressure media companies, and challenge the boundaries of the First Amendment, which means the one Democratic commissioner still on the FCC is openly testifying that her own agency has become a vehicle for political intimidation. And when someone inside the institution is sounding the alarm this loudly, we need to listen, because Ana Gomez said she's been open in calling out Carr, including on X, for using the weight of government power to suppress lawful expression, which takes extraordinary courage in the current environment where speaking truth to power can be career suicide. Let me take you through the specific timeline of how this chilling effect unfolded, because the precision of the sequence matters. ABC briefly suspended Kimmel's show over comments he made about the September 10 assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, and hours before the suspension, Carr warned that local broadcasters who aired Kimmel could face fines or loss of licenses, and said it's time for them to step up, which shows you the cause and effect relationship between governmental threat and corporate capitulation, and the specific mechanism Carr used is important because Carr threatened to wield the power of the commission against ABC and its network affiliates, saying, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, and this is a very, very serious issue for Disney," and Carr then specifically spoke to affiliates of ABC which hold FCC licenses, telling them, "Frankly, it's past time that a lot of these licensed broadcasters themselves push back. It's time for them to step up." And Carr's words had an immediate effect, as within hours Nexstar and Sinclair, the largest affiliate groups in the country, said they would preempt Kimmel's show, and ABC indefinitely suspended the program, which demonstrates that Carr deliberately targeted the affiliates because he knew that's where the regulatory leverage exists, since networks don't hold licenses but their affiliates do, and by threatening the affiliates he could create bottom-up pressure on ABC without ever having to formally take action against the network itself. And we need to reckon with the intellectual dishonesty of the conservative position on this issue, because the same right-wing commentators who spent years screaming about cancel culture and deplatforming on social media are now celebrating governmental coercion to silence comedians. Pro-Trump podcaster Benny Johnson reshared his interview with Carr after ABC yanked Jimmy Kimmel live, and Johnson wrote, "This is what got Kimmel fired right here," and Johnson continued, "It's called soft power. the left uses it all the time. Thanks to President Trump, the right has learned how to wield power as well, which is a confession that what they're doing is deliberate political retaliation using governmental power, and they're framing it as justified payback. But here's the thing that these fascist cheerleaders don't understand or don't care about. When the left was allegedly using soft power, they were private companies making content moderation decisions, which you can disagree with but which are protected by the First Amendment, because private companies aren't bound by it. But when Trump and Carr use the coercive power of federal regulatory agencies to silence critics, that's actual First Amendment violation, because the First Amendment restricts government action. Let's talk about what this means for the broader trajectory of American democracy, because authoritarian consolidation doesn't happen overnight. It happens through incremental norm erosion and institutional capture. The recent actions of the Federal Communications Commission under Chairman Brendan Carr are a warning about what is to come, and in 2023 then-Commissioner Carr posted on social media, "Censorship is the authoritarian's dream," but in light of Carr's recent actions, it appears more like a roadmap to use censorship and the power of the FCC to expand authoritarian control, which is the perfect distillation of how Trumpism operates through projection. They accuse their opponents of authoritarianism while actively implementing authoritarian tactics, and when you go back and read Carr's old tweets about free speech and FCC restraint, it's clear he was articulating principles he never believed in. He was just positioning himself for this moment, and the consolidation of media ownership that I mentioned earlier creates the perfect ecosystem for this kind of capture, because when ownership of the means of expression is concentrated in just a few companies, it is easier for governments to put pressure on those companies, and the Trump-Carr strategy appears to be reshaping the media landscape in this direction, which means we're not just watching episodic attacks on individual journalists or shows, we're watching the systematic construction of a media environment where criticism of Trump becomes financially and legally untenable for the corporations that control distribution. Now I need you to understand the global context here, because what's happening in America isn't happening in isolation, and just 39 of the 98 nations and territories assessed have an open civic space rating, which means that nearly 3 in 4 people around the world live in a country with restricted conditions, and while civic liberties in countries such as Senegal, Gabon, and Mauritania have improved, there have been noted declines in other major world powers, including France, Germany, and Italy, all 3 of which, like the US, were downgraded from the narrowed to obstructed category, which means this is part of a global authoritarian wave, where established democracies are backsliding simultaneously, and the United States under Trump is now grouped with European countries experiencing democratic deterioration. And when America abandons its role as defender of liberal democratic values, it gives permission to authoritarians everywhere to crack down because they can point to American hypocrisy and say even the United States is doing it. Let me bring this back to the specific constitutional principles at stake, because this isn't just about partisan politics or protecting liberal comedians. This is about whether the First Amendment will survive as a meaningful constraint on governmental power, and Carr, amid pointed questioning from lawmakers at a Senate hearing, suggested that he was simply holding broadcasters to a legally required public interest standard when he was asked about his Sept. 17 remarks on a conservative podcast, in which he threatened ABC and its affiliates if they did not take action on Kimmel, which is Carr's fig leaf for authoritarianism. He's claiming he's just enforcing existing public interest obligations, but Sen. Ed Markey said to the agency chief, "You are not reinvigorating the public interest standard, you are weaponizing the public interest standard," and he is turning the Federal Communications Commission into the Federal Censorship Commission. "It is a betrayal of the FCC's mission. You should resign, Mr. Chairman." Because what Carr is doing is taking language that was designed to ensure broadcasters serve diverse viewpoints and turning it into a cudgel to punish broadcasters who air viewpoints Trump doesn't like. And this is the authoritarian technique of maintaining the formal structure of laws and institutions while completely inverting their purpose. And we need to confront the role that Trump himself plays in this apparatus of oppression, because while Carr is the proximate actor, Trump is the prime mover, and on Air Force One Thursday, Trump said that the broadcast networks were 97% against me, and said they're getting a license. I think maybe their license should be taken away. It will be up to Brendan Carr. I think Brendan Carr is outstanding. He's a patriot. He loves our country and he's a tough guy, so we'll see. Which is Trump openly directing Carr to investigate and potentially revoke broadcast licenses based on critical coverage, and the phrase "it will be up to Brendan Carr" is Trump giving Carr his marching orders in public. And when Carr claims the FCC isn't independent and refuses to say whether Trump is his boss, this is what he's referring to. Trump tells him what to do, and Carr does it. And here's the pattern that should alarm you, because 1 hour before Kimmel's monologue aired, President Trump proved him right, posting a blustery new legal threat against ABC on Truth Social, and Trump claimed Kimmel puts the network in jeopardy by playing 99% positive Democrat garbage. He is yet another arm of the DNC, and to the best of my knowledge that would be a major illegal campaign contribution. I think we're going to test ABC out on this, which is Trump threatening litigation as another form of pressure on top of the regulatory threats. And this multi-pronged assault of regulatory intimidation, plus legal threats plus presidential attacks, creates an environment where no media company feels safe criticizing the president. Let's examine the specific ideological project underlying this assault, because it's not just about Trump's thin skin or his personal vendetta against critics. It's about reconstructing American media to serve authoritarian ends. Carr rose to prominence in 2024 after he wrote the chapter on the FCC in the conservative blueprint known as Project 2025, and in it he railed against technology and media companies' censorship of right-wing content and values and promotion of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which tells you this is part of the broader Project 2025 agenda to dismantle every institution that constrains conservative power, and Carr's chapter in Project 2025 laid out the blueprint for exactly what he's doing now, using the FCC's regulatory authority to punish media companies that promote progressive values or platform progressive voices, and the fact that Carr was one of the key authors of Project 2025, despite Trump's campaign trying to distance itself from it, proves that Project 2025 is the actual governing agenda, and everything they said during the campaign about not knowing about it was a lie. And we need to talk about the complicity of tech and media platforms more broadly, because while ABC and Disney are the most visible capitulators, they're not the only ones. And the consolidation wave that's sweeping through media means more and more companies are vulnerable to exactly this kind of pressure. Nexstar, the nation's largest chain broadcaster, has agreed to purchase a smaller chain for $6.2 billion, a combination that would put it in 80% of American homes and vastly exceed the FCC rules. And Nexstar owns 32 ABC affiliates and was quick to respond to Carr's comments about Kimmel, and this consolidation aligns with the massive shift in the media ecosystem. Carr forecast, which means Carr is simultaneously facilitating mega mergers that concentrate media ownership while using the approval process for those mergers as leverage to control content. And the Nexstar situation is the perfect example, because they need FCC approval for a merger that would make them the dominant force in local broadcasting, and they immediately pulled Kimmel after Carr's threats, which is exactly the kind of quid pro quo that makes a mockery of independent regulation. Now, I want to address the argument that you might hear from conservatives that this is just enforcement of existing rules, and that Kimmel's comments were somehow beyond the pale, because, in his show's opening monologue on Sept 15, Kimmel said Trump supporters were desperately trying to characterize Tyler Robinson, the 22-year-old charged in Kirk's killing, as anything other than one of them, which was political commentary about how MAGA was trying to distance itself from a murderer who had far-right connections. And you can agree or disagree with Kimmel's characterization, but it's obviously protected political speech, and the claim that this constitutes news distortion or violates public interest obligations is absurd on its face, because Kimmel hosts a comedy show, not a news program, and political satire has been constitutionally protected since the founding of the Republic. And even if you think Kimmel's joke was in poor taste or factually wrong, the solution in a free society is more speech, not government censorship. You don't deploy federal regulatory agencies to silence comedians because they made jokes you don't like. That's what they do in Russia and China and Hungary, and now apparently the United States under Trump. Let me bring this to the present moment, because just yesterday in that Senate hearing we saw the complete picture of where this is heading. Amy Klobuchar asked Carr, "Do you think it is appropriate to use your position to threaten companies that broadcast political satire?" And Carr replied, "I think any licensee that operates on the public airwaves has a responsibility to comply with the public interest standard, and that's been the case for decades," which is a non-answer that dodges the constitutional question, because Klobuchar isn't asking about the public interest standard. Generally, she's asking specifically about using regulatory threats to punish political satire, and Carr's refusal to directly answer tells you he knows what he's doing is indefensible, but he's going to do it anyway. And Sened Markey told Carr, "You are weaponizing the public interest standard. That is what the Carr FCC is doing every single day." And Markey urged Carr to resign, which is the appropriate response to someone who has fundamentally betrayed their oath of office, because Carr swore to uphold the Constitution, including the First Amendment, and instead he's using the power of his office to violate it. And here's the through line to the broader Trumpist assault on democratic institutions, because the FCC under Carr is just one node in a network of captured agencies that are being weaponized for political ends. In January, Carr reinstated complaints about a CBS interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris, a debate moderated by ABC News between then-President Joe Biden and Trump, and an appearance by Harris on Comcast-owned NBC's Saturday Night Live shortly before the election, which shows you the pattern. Carr is retroactively investigating media coverage that he claims favored Democrats, and you should ask yourself what it means for press freedom when the FCC chairman is investigating networks for how they covered an election or which political candidates they interviewed. Because if that becomes the norm, then every network will be terrified to cover politics at all, unless it's in a way that flatters whoever's in power. This is the construction of a soft, authoritarian media environment, where formal censorship isn't necessary, because the chilling effect is so comprehensive that self-censorship does the work for you. Let me zoom out to the global authoritarian context one more time, because the tactics Trump and Carr are deploying have been documented by scholars of authoritarianism for decades. Maria Ressa noted that we are in an accelerated process in the U.S., and a lot of whether the U.S. survives is dependent on what we do now. Every day that we do not act, we get weaker, which is the warning from someone who lived through authoritarian consolidation in the Philippines and watched how Duterte used exactly these tactics to crush independent media. And Ressa is telling us that America is on the same trajectory, just moving faster, and the time frame for resistance is shrinking, because authoritarian capture accelerates as it proceeds. The more institutions they capture, the easier it becomes to capture the next one. Experts on democratic backsliding underscore that what we are witnessing is the deployment of the classic authoritarian playbook, a pattern of strategies that strongmen have deployed across the globe to overtake democracies, and they warn that the rise of authoritarianism is often a gradual process that happens within and under a legal facade, and once in power would-be dictators use a series of aggressive tactics aimed at centralizing power by controlling the media and dismantling democratic norms and institution, which is exactly what we're seeing with Carr and the FCC. They're using the legal structure of regulatory agencies to achieve authoritarian ends, and because it's happening through bureaucratic processes rather than overt repression, it's harder for people to recognize it as the threat it is. So what do we do about this? Because rage and analysis are necessary but insufficient if they don't translate into action. And the first thing is we cannot let this become normalized. Every single instance of governmental intimidation of media needs to be treated as the constitutional crisis it is. We need sustained protest mobilization, attention, because the authoritarian strategy depends on each outrage fading from the news cycle before the next one lands. Second, we need to support independent media financially and politically, because the consolidation of corporate media has created this vulnerability, so we need to build alternative infrastructure that isn't dependent on FCC licenses or merger approvals, and that means supporting nonprofit journalism, independent streaming platforms, international outlets that can't be threatened by American regulators. Third, we need to demand that democratic officials use every tool at their disposal to constrain Carr's power. That means congressional oversight hearings like the one we just saw. That means appropriations riders that limit FCC authority. That means lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of these regulatory threats. And that means making this a central campaign issue in 2026, because if Democrats don't take back Congress, then Carr and Trump will have free rein to complete the authoritarian transformation of American media. And let's be clear about the stakes, because this isn't just about protecting late-night comedians or preserving media criticism of Trump. This is about whether the United States will remain a country where citizens can speak freely without fear of governmental retaliation. The ACLU said Jimmy Kimmel is the latest target of the Trump administration's unconstitutional plan to silence its critics and control what the American people watch and read. Cowering to threats, ABC, and the biggest owner of its affiliate stations, gave the Trump FCC chairman exactly what he wanted by suspending Kimmel indefinitely and dropping the show, and this is beyond McCarthyism. Trump officials are repeatedly abusing their power to stop ideas they don't like, deciding who can speak, write, and even joke. The Trump administration's actions paired with ABC's capitulation represent a grave threat to our First Amendment freedoms, which puts this in the proper constitutional and historical context. Because the ACLU, which has defended free speech across the political spectrum for a century, is saying this is beyond McCarthyism, which means we're in unprecedented territory for governmental assault on free expression in the modern era. And finally, we need to understand that corporate capitulation is not inevitable. Companies have choices even when they face regulatory pressure. Ana Gomez said that is what's so harmful to our democratic principles. We need companies to think twice about capitulating this way. It is up to those companies to stand up to defend their First Amendment rights instead of capitulating. which means we need to create political and economic incentives for corporate resistance, and that means boycotts and social pressure and public shaming of companies that choose profit over principle, and it means celebrating and supporting companies that stand firm, because if every network and every affiliate group caves immediately like ABC and Nexstar did, then Trump and Carr win without ever having to follow through on their threats. But if companies force them to actually take formal action, then at least we get court cases where judges can rule on the constitutionality of what they're doing. The authoritarian power grab only works if the targets surrender preemptively, and our job is to make surrender more costly than resistance. What you witnessed in that Senate hearing room yesterday was Senator Tammy Baldwin and her Democratic colleagues trying to sound the alarm about a Democratic emergency unfolding in plain sight. And Tammy Baldwin said, "You've become a parrot for President Trump and diminished the independence of the FCC, which is the perfect summation of what Brendan Carr has become. He's not a regulator, he's an enforcer. He's not protecting the public interest, he's serving Trump's personal interests, and the fact that he admitted under oath that the FCC is not an independent agency should have been the front page headline of every newspaper in America, because that's an agency head confessing that the institutional independence that's supposed to protect us from political abuse no longer exists. This is the authoritarian moment. This is what democratic backsliding looks like in real time. And the question is whether enough Americans will recognize the threat and mobilize to stop it before it's too late. Because once authoritarian control of media is fully consolidated, it becomes exponentially harder to reverse, and we're running out of time to prevent that consolidation. The fight for free speech and independent media, and constitutional democracy itself, is happening right now in real time, and it demands every ounce of our attention, courage and resistance, because the alternative is an America where criticism of the president can get you silenced by your own government, and that's not America anymore. That's something much darker, and we cannot let that be our future.